All right, good morning. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Panel. I'm Abby Stockwell. I will be moderating and giving a quick, brief introduction as to why we're talking about stormwater at, why we're talking about environmental justice at a stormwater conference. And then I will hand it off to the real presenters, Millie Piazza, also from Ecology, Janell Majewski from Snohomish County, and Shauna Hansen from the city of Tacoma. And we will leave plenty of time at the end for questions, but feel free to add them to the chat as we go along. So we, within the municipal stormwater permits and our recent reissuance in 2019, we took the definition of overburdened communities from the US EPA and added it to our permit language. So in these sections that you see listed below in the bullets here is where we've added this term overburdened communities. So in public involvement, permittees are encouraged to reach out to overburdened communities to ensure that they are involved in the stormwater management plan development and making any sort of decisions around that. In public education and outreach, overburdened communities are an option as a target audience. In stormwater planning, we talk about identifying where overburdened communities may be located in your jurisdiction and using that to guide your prioritization of where you may implement some stormwater management strategies to help develop that stormwater management action plan. And also in the phase 1 permit, the structural stormwater control program, if permittees implement a project located in an overburdened communities, that project gets additional points, project points for being located there. So that is my quick introduction. And now I'm going to hand it off to Millie.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Millie Piazza, and I'm the Environmental Justice Coordinator at the Washington State Department of Ecology. And I think my goal here this morning is just kind of set the stage, talk a little bit about what environmental justice is, what it means to Washington, and then just to give you a quick peek into some of the tools that the Department of Ecology uses and how we're thinking about environmental justice before we get to our other presenters who are really going to dig into what they're doing on the ground. So the first thing I just wanted to kind of bring us to an understanding of is where EJ came from and really what it's grounded in. And it really, environmental justice began as a movement of community protests and advocacy across the US, really protests by communities that felt that they were being targeted for unwanted land uses, whether this be facilities or dumps or incinerators. And the communities protesting in the environmental justice movement are communities that are primarily communities of color and low-income communities. And this national attention really started getting moving in the late 70s, and it led to, I would say from the early 80s, quite a bit of both academic research, government research to investigate the claims about environmental injustice and environmental racism. And specifically what studies found, academic studies found across the US is that nationally, people of color and low-income populations are in fact disproportionately exposed to hazardous sites and pollution. So what you see on the screen, there are some early shots of the protests in Warren County in the late 70s, early 80s. And then the pictures on the bottom are from Washington State, and there was a Department of Health report that really talked about, well, what does EJ look like in Washington? What are some key areas of concern? And what the report highlighted was that, yes, like the national pattern, people of color and low-income folks, particularly living in urban industrial areas, have higher rates of exposure to environmental hazards. And this is correlated with higher rates of respiratory disease, lower birth weight babies, and poorer health outcomes. Same for communities of color and low-income communities within a mile of the SeaTac area, having higher rates of lung, oral, and throat cancer. Another big issue for Washington State was potential pesticide exposure to farm workers, and particularly noting the lack of adequate health care to farm workers, and the lack of availability of physicians who were trained in recognizing the signs of pesticide exposure. And then one of the final issues that they highlighted in this report is the consumption of contaminated fish, particularly of our tribal communities, immigrant communities, Asian communities who consume fish at much higher rates and much higher quantities, and potentially consume this fish from waters that are contaminated with methylmercury and PCBs. So essentially, what environmental injustice looks like is, I think, really summed up in this President's Cancer Panel report, that people from disadvantaged populations are more likely to be employed in occupations with higher levels of exposure and to live in more highly contaminated communities. And that is exactly, it's the nexus of where pollution is or where environmental hazards are, with who lives there, which is predominantly nationally people of color and low-income folks. But it's also, I would say, that the environmental justice movement has really grown, and it's looking at, and where are the amenities? Where are the parks? Where are the walkable pathways? Where are the sidewalks, lighting, safe spaces, healthy communities? So it's really become a much more complex academic field of study, as well as practice in government. And I'm really proud to say that the Department of Ecology has been invested in environmental justice work for over 25 years. The Department of Ecology was they were given some money in 1993, I believe, to conduct the state's first environmental justice study. And essentially what that study did was it looked at the data in Washington State. Where are areas that are considered potentially hazardous or potentially where people would be exposed to pollutants, looked at sites, thousands of sites across Washington, and then looked at the census data to see who's living there, and found the same pattern as nationally, is that people of color and low-income populations live disproportionately near environmental hazards. And it's very interesting. I've served in my position for about 15 years now as a senior advisor for EJ at Ecology, and it's a very challenging field because, as you may know, I'm sorry, I have to pause. Abby, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, it's a Monday, I guess. My computer is gone, but anyways, I'll keep going. So what we know is that, and what I was saying was that this work is incredibly challenging, is because we don't really have best practices for Washington. So while we have been invested for quite a while in Washington, we don't actually have a state law that guides us on environmental justice. So what I do in my work is rely on decades of federal guidance, on federal and academic research, and the practices that they have built up over the last 20 to 30 years. And a lot of the work and practices at the federal level stem from a 1994 executive order on environmental justice. But in that executive order, it really called on the federal agencies to dig in deep on environmental justice, build it into your missions, create practices, collect data. But for myself, while I rely on a lot of those best practices to help me guide the Department of Ecology, what I also rely on is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which many of you may be familiar with. This is not an environmental law. This law applies to any recipient of federal financial assistance. And so that includes the Department of Ecology. We get federal funding, but also it applies to any subrecipient. So any money that we pass along to other entities or grantees, they're also accountable to compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And what the Civil Rights Act is it's our basic non-discrimination law. And what it says that is any of our activities or programs cannot discriminate based on race, color, or national origin. And the reason that Title VI is so important is because it really upholds people's rights. It ensures non-discrimination, ensures people have access to government processes and amenities and decision-making. And ultimately, the executive order on environmental justice pointed to Title VI as one of the mechanisms to really lay the foundation of environmental justice. And it really gets at, as I mentioned, non-discrimination, not allowing discrimination based on race. And it also really digs into public participation. And that really fuzzy image in the background, there's actually a checklist. The Environmental Protection Agency, which is the agency that I look to for most of our agency's environmental justice guidance, really has created a checklist, which sets that bare minimum foundation of what compliance looks like. Just looking at employee awareness about Title VI and non-discrimination, about posting signs in our buildings to let people know that we have language services. And it makes sure that we are accountable to serving all people when we have public meetings and processes. So you can even look up, this checklist is, if I had Zoom up right now, I could put it into the chat, but it's called the Title VI procedural checklist, and it literally is a checklist. It's a blueprint for how to think about non-discrimination for your agency or the group that you work with. And Ecology has been investing in this EJ and Title VI work, as I said, for quite a while. We do some things routinely, such as translating documents. This is an example of a document for businesses that, if we translate into languages that their workforce speaks, this is going to further our goal of compliance. We've recently translated a number of videos into Spanish and Korean. I think we're working on Chinese and Vietnamese right now. This is on how to make an inexpensive air filter fan, specifically during wildfire smoke season and the times when folks, particularly in Eastern Washington, need a cleaner indoor air. I know that I just checked last night, the Spanish version has over 17,000 views. I believe the Korean version has almost 2,000 views. The English version has about over 250,000 views. We focus quite a bit on language access because it's one of the best ways to quickly and easily get at serving a very diverse population. There's very specific language and guidance in Title VI about language access. And this particular map on the screen right now is a map that you all can, it's publicly available. It's through the EMD, the Emergency Management Division, and you can click on counties or census tracts and very quickly find out what the populations are there who may not speak English very well. And you can find out what the predominant languages are to tailor your translation or interpretation services for. Other really amazing maps and publicly available mapping tools, you may be aware of EJ Screen. I know one of our presenters is going to dig into this. But this, at your fingertips, within minutes, you can get information on demographic information about your communities. There's another emerging tool called the Washington Tracking Network. It has a mapping layer that's specifically on EJ, so you can find out if you can screen for potential environmental justice considerations in communities. Again, this is at the Department of Health. And then I'm wrapping it up. We've used this tool extensively in our grants to find out where we do grants. And also this particular map on the screen shows where our cleanup sites are. So it helps us understand where we're doing our work. And really, for me, it's even more important about where we're not doing our work, whether there are service gaps. I am going to wrap it up here just because I know we want to have questions and answers, but I just want to quickly mention that we've integrated environmental justice and Title VI considerations into our grant making processes, such as the Volkswagen diesel emissions scandal. We had quite a bit of settlement money from that we're distributing to areas and projects across the state. And so we have EJ integrated into our grant programs. We have an external site. And just to wrap it up, I think that as we move through this hour that we have together, the key questions and the key thoughts that I pose to folks within our agency is environmental justice is really thinking about who is and isn't involved in your work, and who is and isn't benefiting, and who is and isn't getting burdened from the work and the decisions that you do. And then really asking all of our colleagues and ourselves, if our work is the work that we're doing and the processes that we have in place, are they reducing disparities for overburdened communities and underserved populations? And that is the core of what environmental justice work is. And that's it. Now, I'm not sure, Abby, is there a way to wrest the presentation back from me?
I think I just did it, Millie.
Oh, fabulous.
All right, are we seeing the next presentation?
Yes, we are.
All right. So thanks. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what Snohomish County has put together. We've developed some tools to understand where and how communities are impacted. And so the first thing we did is we looked at the guidance from the NPDES permit, and it referenced two tools that we could use to identify communities that are impacted: the EJ screen and the environmental health disparities, or EHD map. This was referred to as the WTN in Millie's presentation just now. So when we evaluated these, we decided that we liked the EHD data set a little bit better. And that's because it has more options to view the data. It has this aggregate grouping level that the EJ screen doesn't have. We like that the EHD was developed with input from the impacted communities in Washington. And we like the fact that the EHD had more socioeconomic indicators. So we had our GIS analyst go to the Department of Health website and download the EHD data set. And we used that to create two tools, a GIS tool and a spreadsheet tool. So the GIS Webmap tool, this is available to non-GIS users. And basically what we wanted to do was overlay the environmental health disparities data with some other data that's helpful to project managers. So we added in county properties, which is the purple blocks. We have census tracts, watershed subbasins, and really importantly for the NPDES permit, the county MS4 area. So that's these brown lines that you see on the map. And then we have all the environmental health disparities data within the map. If you pop open these pluses, you can see all the indicators that go into each of the factors. And I'll show you that a little bit more in a minute. We also have cities and the Tulalip Reservation. So we kind of just consider this the base map. There's a lot of other data you could use for use with this. And I see the utility of this as really kind of exploratory analysis. So if you're just interested in knowing, I'm going to go work in this community over here. Are they impacted by anything environmentally or socio-demographically? You can go take a look, or you could just ask the question, you know, where in my jurisdiction are communities impacted? There is a pretty significant limitation in that you can only see one rank at a time. And so this led us to create the spreadsheet tool. So what you see here is the first column is the census tracts in Snohomish County. And then we have the cumulative or the overall EHD rank, followed by the aggregate levels, or composite levels for each of the four groupings. So and then if you pop this open, this is Excel, you'll see the rankings for all the indicators that go into each of these aggregates. And again, I'll show you what that data looks like in just a second. We also added in the limited English proficiency data set, or the LEP data set. We added this in based upon a recommendation from our public outreach specialist. She felt that by adding this in, she would basically have all she needed in order to develop her program. And if you pop this data set open, you'll see the top 5 languages spoken in each community. All right, so I'm going to give you an example of how these two tools can work together. Let's say that you just were interested in knowing where in Snohomish County are communities most impacted. Well, for us, it's in our southern kind of area, and we have 5 communities that rate an 8 or a 9 in kind of the cumulative or overall EHD ranking. And those are pointed out here. We do not have any 10s. So this is great to know, very interesting, but you may want to dig in. Why are these communities impacted? And this is really where the spreadsheet tool is valuable. So here are the spreadsheet data for the environmental threats, which includes the environmental exposures and the environmental effects. We filtered the data, so it just shows those 5 communities that were highlighted. And then you can see that there are some similarities between the communities. So all of them are generally near I-5, but there's also a lot of differences. Some of them have more, nitrous oxide diesel emissions. Some of them are more impacted by particle size 2.5 concentrations. And then down here on environmental effects, you see some have more risk from lead in housing, where there's none of the communities are generally in proximity to a Superfund site. If you look at the socio-demographic data for those 5 communities, again, you see some commonalities. All of them share relatively high housing burdens. All of them are impacted by poverty. None of them have super high transportation expense. And then finally on the bottom there, you see a little bit more of our limited English proficiency data. So you can see that in all of these communities, Spanish is the language spoken most often, besides English, of course. And all of these communities have relatively high proportions of Spanish speakers. So again, this is just kind of giving you an indication of how you can better reach out to these communities if you so choose. So I'm just going to end the presentation with a quick couple examples of how you can use this for NPDES. So the first example is for the Stormwater Management Action Planning. So for Snohomish County is going to do that in Little Bear Creek. So the map there on the side shows the Little Bear Creek watershed, which is the blue line there. The ranks in the background are for the linguistic isolation indicator. And you can see that there's a couple of communities that rank higher for linguistic isolation. So this community here and this community that just is on the border of Little Bear Creek. If you pull up the limited English proficiency data set, you'll see that we have rather large populations of Vietnamese speakers, as well as some of the other Asian languages and Arabic. So the project manager for the SMApping project could then go and figure out how to reach out to these communities to ensure they have a say in what we end up doing in Little Bear Creek. The other example I wanted to show is for water quality investigations. This is not a requirement for their permit, but I think it's an interesting case study. So what the map shows is kind of southern area of Snohomish County. The purple lines are our census tracts. The green triangles are water quality investigations for about a year and a half. And what you can see if you look through the data is there's 2 communities that have quite a bit of MS4, but we've never received a water quality investigation complaint from them. They've never reported a potential water pollution problem. And so you might ask, well, why is that? Are there commonalities between these 2 communities that may be driving no complaints, no concerns? And so if you look at the data, you'll notice that both of them rank pretty high on linguistic isolation. So again, the project manager for the investigation program could then decide, do we need to do some sort of outreach to these communities to ensure they know they have this resource to report pollution? Finally, I just want to end with, there are tons of ways this data can be used. Related to NPDES, you could look at your structural stormwater controls and or street sweeping programs, your business inspection programs, your public involvement for your code revision process. But there's also a lot of ways you could use this data outside of NPDES. I think the big question is kind of on the capital projects. Are we equitably distributing services? You could also look at things like drainage investigations and see if there's a correlation between stream health and some of these impacts. That is all I have. I think, Shauna, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Janell. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Okay, great. So while Tacoma Environmental Services Department is still working on how we address environmental justice issues, today I'm going to be providing a brief overview of the tools staff have available to apply an equity lens to analyze disparities and opportunity between different neighborhoods in Tacoma. So first, to lay the groundwork, I'll share a little background on Tacoma's equity and empowerment framework. In 2015, the city adopted this framework in response to a number of citizen surveys and feedback that identified how white community members and communities of color were experiencing our services differently. And last year, the City Council also made a formal commitment to anti-racist transformation of government with the passage of Resolution 40622, partially in response to the deaths of African Americans during police actions, including Manuel Ellis in Tacoma, which affirmed that now more than ever, the work of racial equity and justice is essential to the people of Tacoma and to its future. And all staff at the city are being trained in Equity 101, which lays down a working definition for achieving equity, which is to create the conditions that allow everyone to access the opportunities necessary for satisfying their essential needs, advancing their well-being, and achieving their full potential. Still, many of us in our department, for us, equity is a relatively new way of looking at how we deliver programs and services to our customers. So here we see a figure showing the city's 5 equity goals. And as part of our department's strategic plan, we had a team looking at how we can better provide equitable service delivery. And they noted that the Government Alliance for Race and Equity suggested the use of an equity tool that can help us to develop strategies and actions to reduce inequities and improve success for all groups. So they decided to develop a toolkit that includes a worksheet and also some guidance on 6 steps of reviewing, doing an equity analysis for your program or service. And there's a lot of information on this slide, but the key new pieces in the process are where we build in community data and feedback to help us provide better service delivery to underserved community members. We do this in step 2 by collecting and analyzing data about our services, disaggregated by demographics such as race and income level. And we can do that by mapping our services on the city's equity index map to zero in on the gaps in service around specific groups and neighborhoods, similar to Snohomish County's mapping. And then we also now have steps 3 and 6, where we engage stakeholders to get community feedback and including especially focused efforts to center the needs and voices of marginalized community members that we don't normally hear from, to make our services meet their needs as well. So I wanted to share a little bit about the Equity Index map. The Equity Base Map incorporates census block data related to 29 indicators of access to opportunity. Areas of lower opportunity are in yellow and get darker with increased opportunity, meaning better outcomes for individuals living and working in these areas. And as you can see, South and East Tacoma tend to have more low opportunity areas. And the map also correlates with race and income level. So when we overlay our services and programs on the map, it shows us where there could be disparities in service and helps us identify underserved and overserved neighborhoods. The index is being expanded to include all of Pierce County, which will be available in a few weeks. And there's a current study underway to see if this index could be expanded to cover King and Snohomish County as well, under the Puget Sound Regional Council as an overlay with other regional planning efforts and projects, like, for example, sound transit projects, to help provide similar equity analysis when considering where to invest funds. And here we're just showing the 29 indicators. And these indicators come from different sources of information, from information collected by the city to the Pierce County Health Department to Washington State and other census data. And the environmental health indicators in the 4th column are directly taken from the Department of Health Environmental Health Disparities map, that Washington tracking network that Millie referred to. And as you can see here, each indicator of the 29 indicators can be viewed separately on the map or combined. And although it could be helpful to dive into the data individual layers, generally speaking, when we're doing our equity analysis, we include all of the indicators rolled up in the opportunity index to provide a holistic view of all the interdependent social and environmental factors affecting Tacoma's community members. And I just wanted to also show you this application we're also able to zoom in and select a block in the city where then it will recalculate all of the indicator values based on just that area of town. So although our department is piloting this Equity Toolkit just this year, and I'm in the process right now, kind of in the middle of the process of applying it to the development of Tacoma's watershed management plan, I do have one example of a success story from our urban forestry team where they piloted the toolkit and they were using it on their tree coupon program. So tree coupons are offered and you can get $30 off of up to 3 trees purchased from a local nursery for the program. And when they mapped program usage over the Tacoma Equity Index map, they found that 53% of the coupon requests were located in low opportunity neighborhoods, but only 41% of the coupons were redeemed in those low opportunity neighborhoods. And only 31% of the trees in the program were actually planted in those low opportunity areas. So they wanted to investigate, why this discrepancy. And when they went back and interviewed program participants, they found that they identified some barriers were that the program outreach materials were only offered in English right now. Also, people had barriers of transportation getting to and from the nursery with the tree and other competing needs. So some new strategies they developed were to build relationships with community groups that served some of these diverse neighborhoods to be able to communicate about the program through their community groups to their members, and then also providing language translation of the program materials. So one thing to note too is that we're kind of building the plane as we're flying it with this Equity Toolkit, and we still have some ongoing implementation needs. For example, right now I'm on a team that's helping to develop an equitable engagement strategy and staff training to help our staff to engage with marginalized community groups in a more effective way. So to wrap it up, we found that trying to restructure our programs to address equity can be daunting to staff in our department, especially when we're attempting to correct for gaps in service that we've never evaluated before. But with the support of this Equity Toolkit, staff now have the guidance they need to start the transformation process one program at a time. And here's my contact information. Again, I'd be happy to talk with you more if you have questions about either the toolkit and the worksheet or the Equity Index map in Tacoma. Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. We now have time for questions. I don't yet see any in the chat box, but feel free to throw them in there. I'll start with one. Millie, what advice would you give to people that are starting out that maybe don't feel like experts at environmental justice yet?
Yeah, I think that it's fair to not feel like an expert. I have degrees in EJ and I've been working in this field for 20 years. And I would say that I learn something new every day from reading the paper, from watching a YouTube video, from talking with communities. I think it's something that we don't have to feel like we have expertise in. It's just that we need to just be open to learning more. And I think that there are incredible, you can certainly take a dive into academic research or read. EPA's website is excellent. The Environmental Protection Agency's website has videos from community members. One of my favorite 18 minutes on YouTube is still Majora Carter's Greening the Ghetto TED Talk. It has the full arc of environmental justice, from what it is, the history of it, and it's the vision of sustainability and just creating clean environments, homes, and communities for everyone. It's a great 18 minutes of your time. And then I think as a practitioner, as a bureaucrat, it's about getting comfortable with the data, exploring the tools, finding out what the data says, and then really knowing the communities, getting out there, meeting who it is, who's in the neighborhood, who's attending the fairs, and just really putting faces to the work that we do. Those are super doable things, and they're wonderful to do. I'll put it in the chat, the TED Talk.
Great. All right, questions are starting to roll in. So this next one is for Millie. How does Ecology do translations? Do native speakers review for context, or is it a word for word translation?
That's a great question. And again, like most things, it's really nuanced. The standard that because these translations for the agency have to hold up in court, we definitely do not have a best practice of relying on our possible high school Spanish. We actually have internal translation and interpretation teams that have to go through a vetting process, so that if you don't want to use Google Translate, you want to use folks who have a glossary of terms, because you can just well imagine what translations for vapor intrusion might look like for languages that don't have the term vapor intrusion, or even common place names. So we have a fairly high standard of translation, and then we use certified interpreters as well in meetings. We actually have a 24/7 contract with a 24/7 interpretation service. So if you're in the field, or if you're at a public meeting and somebody comes up with you and you're having a language barrier, you can have a three-way call on your phone. Or if I've received a few calls during the pandemic for folks that wanted information. I've got a number that I can quickly call, and within a few seconds bring someone on the phone. And so our standard is that someone writes it. It's often verbatim, and then we have somebody fact check it, word check it. But I will say that in my conversations with our Attorney General, the Attorney General's office, it's about meaningful information. It's about meaningful communication. So it's not just like translate everything. Like the joke, which is not a joke because it was a real scenario, is do you translate a permit? Hundreds a page a permit or a permit policy. My response is people don't want to read it in English. It's not likely they're going to want to read it in Spanish. So what kind of document can we create that's accessible for everyone's learning and is going to help? And then let's translate that. So it's a conversation I love, and would be happy to talk with folks offline about it.
Great, thank you. Do our other panelists want to weigh in on that one? Shall I move on? Okay. All right. The next question is open. Is there work or thought being put into addressing issues of time in underserved communities? For example, would it be harder to attend community meetings if you work 2 jobs or don't have childcare?
Yeah, and that's actually a question that our equitable engagement strategy team is wrestling with right now, because part of the team brings that forward, that basically, especially during the pandemic, there's a lot of competing issues going on right now that could take top place in people's priority list over, like what we want to talk to them about their environmental services issues or stormwater management or what have you. And so I think that's definitely a concern, and it makes us, for some of us, it makes us not even want to really like bother them right now about the issues that we want to talk to them about, because we feel like that's a concern. But on the other hand, there's also kind of the consideration that if you don't ask them, then they can't tell you if they're interested or not. So just offering that conversation is important too. Not making the decision for different groups in the community, whether or not they feel like they have time to participate in the conversations that we're trying to have. And so that's the other side of the coin that we're looking at, is at least trying to offer that opportunity, and then people can choose if they want to participate or not.
Great, thank you. Someone in the chat did ask if you could send the title, or maybe put the title of the TED Talk you mentioned, Millie, into the chat box. Great. The next question is, local level EJ considerations are important, but what about the larger regional context? There are many. Has anyone started to think about expanding their work into a regional context, maybe?
I'd be curious to know I'm not sure. I'll try my interpretation of the question. I think that the value of the mapping tools is that it's not only a regional and state, it is the regional and state context, because the value of the mapping tools is understanding how communities may have inequities or may have disparate health impacts, in income inequalities, health inequalities, environmental inequalities. And so, for example, the Washington Tracking Network tool, that specific environmental justice map is to help us at a glance visualize how communities are different across the state. And so for, I know I blew through the explanation in my presentation, but the purpose and the promise of those mapping tools is that we can really start focusing in and directing resources to areas that have historically been underserved or have been under-resourced. So for example, when I said we look at where our grants are, where we do pollution prevention, we can look across the map and see if there are gaps, and then we can say, hey, we really need to shift more to Eastern Washington, or we need to go to areas that are rural or areas that have the most environmental diesel issues. So it's a way to embed that in a regional and a statewide context by using those mapping tools.
Great, thank you. Next question. With my experience with racial equity toolkits, I found that the data collection, especially data disaggregated by race, can be tough to find. Besides the tools mentioned, what other suggestions do you have?
Well, in Tacoma, we're really leaning a lot on the mapping tool because honestly, we don't collect information about audience information for any of our services based on demographics. We haven't historically, and we're just starting to consider doing that now. And so what we do is we just overlay it on the map that shows where the demographics are, and then we know where our service providing happens, and then we compare it that way right now.
I think that's such a really interesting question too, because I think about the 1994 executive order, and there was really only 3 components to that executive order, and one of those components was data. We need data. Start collecting data, particularly disaggregated data. It doesn't serve communities and populations well when the data are African languages. Good luck trying to translate into African language. That's not a thing. And so particularly we know in Washington State with our Asian and Pacific Islander communities, to lump those all into one aggregated data set does a disservice to some very prominent and problematic health and environmental disparities between different populations within the AAPI community. So it's a great question. I think it's something that's evolving and that we just have to keep being conscientious of. And it really speaks to me about the limitations of any data that are either old or incomplete or inaccessible. And then that really speaks to the importance of building relationships and knowing our communities, knowing who's out there, and knowing on the ground, real time, who's affected and what's happening.
That kind of rolls into our next question, which is saying the new toolkits and the web maps are fantastic tools, but curious how often the data within those tools need to be updated.
As often as possible. Shauna, I think it's a great question. I know that the Department of Health with the Washington Tracking Network, I know that they try to update as they have capacity with the best available data. I know that what's very exciting is that the EPA is doing they're doing a number of interviews across the nation to look at their EPA EJ screen tool to see, well, what data might we incorporate to really get at climate impacts and resilience and potential vulnerabilities and risk. And so they're ever expanding and updating as data are available as well. And both, I would say, both EPA and the Department of Health are open to other data sets. A lot of this has to, the data sets we can only use really in those mapping tools, what is statewide applicable or nationally applicable, where there's really robust, valid data. And that leaves out a lot of issues, but we need to keep bringing up what data are missing. So yeah, so.
Yeah, and a lot of the data, I don't think we've mentioned this, comes from, the Census Bureau or the American Community Survey. And so those are on what, 10-year cycles or something like that. So finding ways to get data updated more frequently than that would be, I think, pretty much a challenge.
Okay, this next question is for Janell or Shauna. Have your agencies evaluated how the marginalized communities have responded to the efforts you described, the disparities map in SNOCO, the equity index in Tacoma? For example, what extent does translation lead to behavior change?
I guess I can start. So we have not started the implementation phase. We're still kind of in the designing phase. I do know that, Snohomish County started its own Office of Social Justice over the last year, probably like many jurisdictions. And what I've heard is that there's so many requests going out to our communities that the communities themselves are getting a little overwhelmed and asking for us as a local government to better integrate our requests. So that might be something to think about as you move forward too.
Yeah, Tacoma, we're in pretty much the same boat as Snohomish County. And so, yeah, I don't have a lot to add there.
Okay, this next question is for Shauna. Can you describe in a little more detail how Tacoma is incorporating the equity index into watershed planning?
Yes, thanks for that question. Right now, we have a grant from the Department of Ecology to create a GIS mapping tool that's a watershed prioritization tool. And so as part of that tool, we're going to be adding in or considering somehow incorporating those equity index indicators into the tool alongside the water quality data, the pollution source data, loading data, and all that information that we would have to assess for the environmental impacts in different watersheds in town. We'd be adding the equity index layers to also consider the community needs as well. So it's kind of a nice opportunity for us that we have that equity index map up and running so that we can use it for our prioritization.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How is EJ being incorporated into government as a whole? This can't just fall on environmental services departments of municipalities. How can we continue to push it forward?
That's such a great question from Daniel. I was just typing in the response. I completely agree. I think that the larger government agencies have not more responsibility, but perhaps have more capacity to do this. And so that's where we're thinking pretty routinely about how do we dish things up so that they're easier. So whether it be mapping tools, which are great, so you don't necessarily have to do internal mapping and have that GIS expertise if we have publicly available tools, if we have more training, I think, on how to do this and I think the key phrase in my mind is that this is a big chunk of work, right? There's environmental justice weaves itself throughout, economic justice, health justice, climate justice. There's just so many layers of this. It's too much. And so the key phrase for me is making reasonable steps. And so providing some guidance to folks on what reasonable steps are, I think is a good way to help partner with municipalities and just really to work together as agencies, as community group and agencies and academic partnerships, really building that community of practice so that it's a mutual lift, not a responsibility. And that the same goes true, like not only for municipalities, but communities. A lot of the work that I see in environmental justice is like, oh, well, give the community this, educate the community about this. Is like, as we mentioned, that community fatigue on dealing with the issues that communities are already dealing with, having this additional burden doesn't make sense either. And so really constantly thinking about how do we bring this back and create accountability within our own agencies. I will say, I don't think we touched on it, but there's an environmental justice bill moving through legislative session right now that's very interesting. It captures a number of the key recommendations that came out of the environmental justice task force that was convened last year to dish up key recommendations on how to do environmental justice and embed practices in state agencies. And so that's a great document to reference as well, to see what the state government is thinking, what's the state government suite of agencies is thinking about how to embed these practices.
I think at the local level, what that looks like in Tacoma is that our departments are working together on our community engagement and our equitable service delivery, so that we're kind of like Janell mentioned, we're doing the work internally to coordinate ourselves so that we're not trying to pepper the community with different programs all separately, because what we keep talking to each other about is really, I mean, who the community is seeing us as is not environmental services department. We're just someone from the city. And so it's very important for us to do the work on our end to coordinate between our departments as much as we can where things overlap.
And I'll just add, I think it's also about, for those of us who have, you know, started down the path and are moving forward, to educate the people that work with us and spending some time, because a lot of people aren't even going to have time to look at maps or even know these maps exist. So just spending some time so our colleagues know kind of the issues that our communities are facing, I think is also important.
Yeah, this might be part of, that might have been part of your answer, but what are some of the things, Janell and Shauna, you wish you knew when you started out on this endeavor?
I guess I'll start. So I'm going to tell a story in order to answer this question. So as part of the tools we're creating, we put together this PowerPoint, and the goal of the project, the PowerPoint, was just to explain the NPDES requirements, kind of explain the mapping tools, kind of looked at it as just like, these are the facts, this is what it is, kind of a harmless presentation. And then we sent it out to review to some of our colleagues, and the responses we got from colleagues who don't look like me, right, the non-white colleagues, was that it was, it did not make them feel good. It used language that was inappropriate. It seemed to contribute to this feeling of us versus them. And so I think what I wish I would have known is how much I contribute to the problem without even knowing it, just by simple use of language. An example is including they, this, that community. Just take out the word that and just say communities, and that is, that's not exclusionary. So, and also just being really up to date on the words that communities want to be, or how communities want to describe themselves. It's been definite. I feel like every time I jump into it, it's just a learning process and I learn something new. So I think that's what I wish I would have known.
Just stepping off from what Janell said, that's one thing we talk about in our Equity 101 training with all the staff in our department. It's not about if I offend, it's about when I offend, just to kind of take the pressure off people to know that, you know, during these conversations and when we're getting in this work, it's inevitable that we're not going to say the right thing at some point and people are going to have hurt feelings, but just to take that misstep and learn from it and incorporate it into your response next time is what we need to do. And the other thing that, you know, I was thinking about this question, Abby, and the other thing that I think is really important to emphasize is that there's a place for me in the conversation around equity and environmental justice as an engineer. So even though equity is not my expertise, and I come from a white privileged background, it's okay. It's important for me to be involved because I know my body of work. I'm the expert on my body of work, and so I'm the one who can identify in the projects that I work on and the tasks that I do day to day where equity can come into play. And I find that even though I'm not an equity expert, that when I think maybe, you know, my supervisor or my manager or somebody else may have been identifying where equity needs to happen in my job, that usually isn't the case because, you know, again, I'm the expert in the work that I do. And so it's really been helpful to just kind of be trying to ask the question, just ask the question and see what, people say. And a lot of times people haven't thought about it. And so then we can start thinking about it.
Thank you. So any of you have any recommended trainings to use the Washington Health Disparities Map or EJ Screen?
Both maps have, there's video on either the Washington Tracking Network site or the EPA EJ Screen site. They both have how-to videos. Abby, I think that you linked in our resource page a really quick how-to guide on EJ Screen that Ecology has put together. I would say that there's opportunities to collaborate also. I'm especially thinking about, did we mention the community, I'm sorry, I'm losing words now, the environmental justice discussion groups or meeting groups that we're convening, that Lori's convening? Has that been mentioned?
Not yet. We'll end on that part.
Okay, then I would say groups like that have an opportunity to bring in speakers and just have, there's like Cheryl Stowe's at EPA, the Freelander and Jen Sable at Department of Health. They field these types of questions and work with these data. Of course, every day they're the leads for those agencies on these tools, and they are more than willing to talk about how to use them. And then of course, contacting the agencies like folks like myself and Abby who use these tools to hear how we use them, and then Shauna and Janell.
Thank you. A new question's come in. How do folks feel about using the term, or how do folks feel about the term residents? We try to use that instead of citizens in Tacoma.
You know, the latest I've heard and that I've been told by folks is that residents is not preferred because, I mean, this gets at balancing. If you literally mean residents because you have vapor intrusion issues or you have something there and you need to talk with those folks that are living right there, then maybe residents is the right word. But I see that, you know, there's this tension between, well, citizens, residents, people. Residents, I have come to understand, might imply, again, a legal status issue, or might imply homeowners versus renters. And so why not simply say people, or the local population, or whatever it is? Let's just bring it back to really what it's about, which is about people. It's not about any other type of category, unless it really is about another type of category. So, you know, I think it's bring it back to basics. I think whenever we use that kind of either labeling or maybe a reductionist kind of approach where we say BIPOC or something like this, when we really mean the Southeast Asian community or the Black community, I think we need to get specific when we can get specific, because that helps.
What are some of the methods to help all staff incorporate EJ principles and techniques into their work, rather than relying on EJ experts within each agency or organization, which is our current default?
I think it's challenging because I think people don't feel confident. You know, if it's just a staff person who's not on the EJ team at work or who's not on the equity team, then, you know, I find that a lot of times they don't feel qualified or something to work on an issue. And so when we do our mandatory all staff training on Equity 101, that's something that we try and encourage every staff person to feel empowered to look at, and then just lean on, you can lean on those equity experts at work, you know, or your Office of Equity staff, and try and run things by them and get ideas from them, but just help people feel empowered to, again, like ask the question and then find resources at work who are may have more expertise.
Can I just really chime in really quick? I think that there's, again, some fundamental, like, easy steps to take too. So for example, when you look at EJ Screen, if you just look at the mapping tool, it's huge. There's so many things to do. What do you do? So like our little 5-pager on click on this, click on this, click on this, and how do you interpret it? I mean, there's guidance on how you interpret it. It's not just a free-for-all or arbitrary application of how you look at EJ Screen. Very specifically, you look at one column of demographic information. And if any of those numbers are above 80, that's a clue, or that's your screening for understanding that there might be EJ considerations there. So these tools have made it more accessible. I think you can build confidence very quickly on using these tools and really having fun with these tools to help build that capacity across the agency or across your staff.
Thank you. We wanted to ask the audience if anyone has any tools that they're using at their local level. And so if you could just put that in the chat, that would be great. And then one sort of last, maybe last question in case some more come in, or unless some more come in. Janell and Shauna, how are you connecting EJ and stormwater management? The big one.
That's a great question. I mean, that's part of the problem with the tools, is that there's nothing that's related to stormwater specifically within the tools. There's no environmental threat posed by stormwater that's been quantified. So I think right now the big push is to use it for public involvement, make sure we're getting the communities that are generally not English speaking, that they have a say, they know things are going on, that they can actually make a difference in our decisions. That, I think, is our first step. I do think that the question of what are those things about stormwater that could impact their people's health, and how we get that kind of data into some of these tools is a really fascinating way to step forward. And maybe one of these working groups that Abby's going to talk about in a little bit could move in that direction.
Yeah, and in Tacoma, we're looking at the different elements of the NPDES permit about the incorporating and addressing overburdened communities in those different areas of the permit. But for myself on the watershed management planning team, with development of the watershed management plan, which will help us to target different stormwater actions in different parts of town, reviewing all of the equity indicators in the equity index map is really key, because even though none of those equity indicators relate specifically to stormwater, that's still a tool that helps us frame people's reality. And so these are health and social factors that everyone is dealing with in Tacoma in different neighborhoods, and that on top of what's happening with their stormwater management. So it's still an important tool in our opinion.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to our panelists. I really appreciate your time and contributions. And to our audience, thank you for attending. We wanted to end, in case you're inspired to get involved and do more on this topic. Lori Larson-Pugh at the Stormwater Center is helping to convene 2 stormwater environmental justice groups. One is more of the broader stormwater world and environmental justice, and the other one is more municipal stormwater. It is municipal stormwater permit and EJ related. So you can reach out to Lori for both of those. They're both just getting started, so now's a good time. And you don't need to be an EJ expert on this. This will be a forum for you to come and learn and contribute and help wrestle with these tough topics. So thank you all so much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Municon.